Welcome to the Karma Yoga introduction. We often give this class as an introduction to new Karma Yogis, simply because Karma Yoga is not an easy practice, and it is not even fully understood as a practice in itself. We don't often know how it can be a practice, what is the practice involved there, and that is because it's simply not easy to understand. It requires us to understand karma, first of all, so we'll talk about that term a little bit. And it also requires quite a bit of an understanding of what yoga actually means. So let's maybe start from this place where we would briefly translate and perhaps introduce the idea of what yoga means. Any ideas? Yoga translation? Union. So union is a common translation. Sometimes you hear also to connect, to yoke together. There is even this connection between yoke and yoga, where you can see that Sanskrit is actually related linguistically with English and German and a few other languages. So the union is relatively well known as the idea of yoga. But between what is a different story. A lot of people have different ideas of what really is that union. And to cut a long story short, the union that we could perhaps put before all others is that between microcosm of the individual and macrocosm of the universe. And that is not really something that we create per se. We don't go about creating union between each and every one of us and the universe. It is rather the recognition of that union that yoga is all about. So the practices of yoga have the purpose of making us realize the union of all things. And we realize that union through the different practices of yoga. Traditionally, there's 4 kinds of yoga, you might say. And those 4 are Raja Yoga, first of all. Raja Yoga being the royal yoga, which entails a huge amount of different practices, a lot of subcategories. Some people say it's everything that's got to do with energy. Other people would say it's the part of yoga that has everything to do with the mind. And there isn't as much of a difference between those 2 approaches as it might seem. So Raja Yoga is a huge field in itself that we won't actually talk about right now. But this is very much what most people are operating within when we practice, say, Hatha Yoga, Kundalini Yoga. Those things are part of Raja. Then we have Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga is the yoga of knowledge, of spiritual knowledge, which is very much related to the practices of meditation. You'll also find meditation in Raja Yoga, so the boundaries are not completely sharp, but Jnana Yoga is specifically meant for practices that give us insight into the higher truths through meditation. Then we have Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, where this recognition of union is reached through a devotional state. And we'll talk about that more in our kirtans and at other times as well. It's as well a huge topic that we can talk about for the rest of the day. And lastly, Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga being the yoga of action, as we often hear. And the action is meaning everything we do. Our everyday life, everything that we perform as an activity could be, hopefully is Karma Yoga. So it is not just something that we do every once in a while. It's not meant to be something that we sign up for at some obscure ashram at the end of the road in Guatemala. It's actually rather an approach that we, as yogis, implement, cultivate at all times. It is something that should define how we act in the world. And how we act in the world is usually a very diverse, a very huge field of options, of opportunities, of ideas, of guidelines, of patterns, we may say. And it seems that we couldn't possibly find one way of acting. But as it happens, our actions actually have consequences. And there is a certain pattern that lies at the bottom of our actions, which is pretty much the same for everyone, and which is lacking, if you will, as we will see in a moment. Before we actually lay that out in more detail, let's look into karma as such. Karma translates as action, specifically pertaining to the effects of our actions. basically connoting the idea that everything we do does have certain results, and that is the experience of most people having spent a few years on this planet. It doesn't seem to be completely random. Whatever we do here seems to have certain effects, certain results, and while we don't always understand how it all fits together, how it all happens, there are patterns, there are certain phenomena of cause and effect that we can perceive, that we can notice. And whenever we do, we perhaps get reminded of this idea of what goes around comes around. That everything we do does have a certain result, and this is more of an intuition perhaps, or even a superstition, than an actual proper knowledge. It's something that many of us feel intuitively somehow. Nonetheless, it's also a physical law. If you look into physics, you will actually find there the laws of thermodynamics, and one of them says that every action is met by an equal and opposite counter-reaction. That is actually a physical law that we can observe everywhere in the universe. So whenever anything happens, there has to be an equal and opposite counter-reaction. And that is just what defines the way the planets move, the way matter interacts with other matter, etc. So there is even a physical expression of that idea of what goes around comes around. Now, if we were to understand that everything that happens in life is the cause or the effect or both of other actions, we sometimes get puzzled. Because there seem to be phenomena that don't fit the bill. There seem to be cases where people do bad things and they don't get punished, and where people do good things and they don't get rewarded. And maybe we get confused, and maybe we get even upset about it, and we're wondering, after a few years, what's up with this? Why is it that good things happen to bad people and vice versa? What is the basis of this karma thing, of this cause and effect of our actions? If good people are rewarded, then where is that effect? Where do you see all the pious people, all the wonderful people living in wealth and happiness? And where do you see all these terrible people suffering from the consequences? Religion, in many cases, tells us, well, that all happens after death. If you're a good person, you enter heaven. If you're a bad person, you find yourself in hell. That's how it is. Take it or leave it. Better believe it, or else you'll be perhaps finding yourself in some predicament. Now, religion has taken that shortcut simply because the reality of things is very complex. It's much harder to understand for the common mind. And we have to understand that Western minds are not really common minds. Most people in the world don't enjoy the degree of education that we enjoy. They cannot easily follow abstract concepts. To understand the nature of reality is not an easy thing to do. It is in fact quite impossible even with our education. Even going through 15, 20 years of education, we may find, well, I still don't know how it works. Who really know how it all works? So education isn't even the total solution, but we have to understand that most people don't have it. And for them, things have to be simplified in very easy terms. Religion is doing that in many cases. So they basically simplify as far as it gets so that everyone can understand. And that is why religion is often called opium for the masses. It is really very, very strongly simplified. Too much so, perhaps. When we look into yoga, we find many abstract concepts. We find many descriptions of how things really work, and it's not always easy to follow those descriptions. When it comes to karma, we will first have to understand that karma is not based on good and evil. It cannot be. Simply because good and evil are not universal constants. They're not fixed. What may look pretty good today might actually turn out pretty bad tomorrow. And what looks bad at first turns out to be a blessing later on. And then what's good for one is probably bad for another. It's always a question of how much do we know, how much are we aware of, who are we talking about. Good and bad are not fixed constants. We cannot say that everything that happens to us is based on our good or bad actions. We may be someone working in some NGO, some organization helping people every day, and it looks like there's a wonderful person there dedicating their life for the benefit of others. And then after some years, it turns out they've actually been putting money aside the whole time. And so, what's going on with those cases? Do we ever have all the information about a given situation? We actually don't. We never have all the facts. We never know all the ins and outs. From our perspective, from our vantage point, we cannot determine if anything is clearly good or clearly bad. And what about all the gray zones, where things are kind of good but also kind of a little bit bad, and we don't really know what's more and what's less? So good and bad don't hold up in the light of consciousness. They're simply not complete ideas, complete pictures. They're not conclusive value judgments that we can simply pass over anything we like. But if good and bad are not the basis of karma, what is? What could be the basis of the effects of our actions? Any ideas? Intention plays into it. Maybe we can make it more precise. What could be those intentions, or what could those intentions be based on? Compassion.
Connectedness, purity, and love.
Love.
Individual benefit versus group benefit?
Versus group benefit. Individual benefit versus group benefit. Okay. Very true. Love versus fear, usually. We could find different ways of how the core idea, the core driving factor is expressing itself. There is a driving force, and it expresses itself perhaps in individual benefit, or in group benefit, or in selfless service, in compassion, in many different things.